The silence in the briefing room stretched on for what felt like forever, while the alien commanders tried to figure out how to recover their dignity after hiding under a table, while the human they had been dismissing remained calm and collected in the face of actual danger. But Lisa decided to help them by pretending nothing embarrassing had happened. General Thex 9 straightened his armor one more time and cleared his throat with a sound like grinding stone, but his voice was quieter now, and carried none of the arrogant confidence it had held just days before, as he asked if perhaps Commander Brooks would be willing to share her complete strategy for dealing with the Void Swarm Threat Prime strategist. Yilandra projected agreement through telepathic channels that felt much more humble than her previous mental communications, and she added that the Volthari Military Command would be very interested in learning more about human tactical approaches, which was quite a change from her earlier dismissal of human intelligence. The Zelen elders floated closer to the tactical display, with their starlight robes still slightly wrinkled, but their ancient eyes now focused on Lisa with the kind of attention they had previously reserved for military archives that were older than Earth, which felt like progress, even if it came at a terrible cost. Lisa looked around the room at faces that had gone from condescending to desperate, and she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness because being right about a disaster didn't feel as good as she had thought it would, especially when so many people were dying because nobody had listened to her warnings. She activated the holographic display and began explaining Operation Wildcard, which was her complete battle plan for fighting an enemy that could learn and adapt faster than any conventional military force, because the key was to use tactics that couldn't be learned or predicted no matter how smart the enemy was. Plan abandoned everything the aliens thought they knew about proper military strategy and instead embraced the beautiful chaos of human warfare, which was based on intuition and creativity and the willingness to do things that made no tactical sense, because sometimes that was exactly what worked. Instead of massive formations, she proposed scattered hit-and-run attacks that would strike at seemingly random targets before disappearing into space without any apparent pattern or purpose, which would make it impossible for the swarm to predict where the next attack would come from. Instead of overwhelming firepower, she suggested surgical strikes using weapons in ways they were never designed to be used, because humans had a talent for taking tools meant for one purpose and finding completely different ways to make them effective. Most importantly, she explained that humans would need to lead each mixed squadron, not because they were better warriors than the aliens, but because they thought differently and would make decisions that couldn't be analyzed or predicted by an enemy that was trying to learn from their behavior. General Thex 9 studied the tactical display with his cracked crystal armor reflecting the holographic lights, and his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive as he asked how human commanders could possibly coordinate effective attacks when their own plans seemed to be based on organized chaos. Lisa smiled for the first time in days as she explained that the beauty of human military thinking was that it wasn't really organized at all because humans had learned to fight by breaking their own rules and improvising solutions to problems they had never seen before, which made them impossible. To counter, she showed them examples of how human commanders like Captain Amy Martinez and Colonel Steve Johnson would lead alien crews in attacks that made no sense according to conventional wisdom, but would work because the swarm wouldn't be able to predict actions that were based on pure human instinct. The aliens listened with growing amazement as Lisa described tactics that involved retreating when winning and advancing when losing and using weapons against targets that shouldn't matter and protecting assets by deliberately sacrificing them to create opportunities. Prime strategist Yilandra projected confusion through her telepathic link as she tried to understand how military decisions could be based on factors that had nothing to do with logical analysis or strategic planning, but Lisa explained that human warfare was an art rather than a science. The Zellan elders consulted their ancient archives looking for historical precedents for the kind of chaotic tactics Lisa was describing, but they found nothing in millions of years of recorded military history, because no other species had ever developed the uniquely human ability to succeed through organized insanity. Admiral Sullivan was already working on communication protocols to coordinate the new operation, while Ryan pulled up fleet rosters to identify human officers who could take command of mixed alien crews, and Lisa felt the first stirring of hope she had experienced since the disaster began. The plan was implemented with desperate efficiency as surviving ships from the failed Operation Starbreak were reorganized into small human-led squadrons that would operate independently according to principles that no military academy had ever taught. Because they couldn't be taught, Captain Amy Martinez took command of a mixed Krithian and Volthari strike force and immediately began planning an attack on a swarm logistics node that every conventional analysis said was strategically worthless. But her human instincts told her it might be important. Colonel Steve Johnson found himself leading Zellan ancient ships in hit-and-run attacks that violated every principle of space combat, but seemed to work because the enemy couldn't predict. Actions that were based on human intuition rather than military doctrine. The results were spectacular in ways that nobody had expected, because the swarm entities that had been learning to counter every known form of galactic warfare suddenly found themselves facing opponents who didn't follow any known patterns or rules. Human commanders made decisions that seemed completely random, but somehow worked because they were based on factors that the swarm couldn't analyze, like gut feelings and lucky guesses, and the kind of creative stupidity that only humans could manage. Within 6 hours, the tide of battle had turned completely as. The emergency session was called 6 hours after Operation Starbreak began, when it became impossible to ignore the fact that the greatest military operation in galactic history was turning into the greatest military disaster in galactic history. And Lisa received orders to report to the main briefing room immediately, which was the first time anyone had wanted to hear from her since the battle started. She walked through corridors filled with running personnel and flashing emergency lights, while damage reports echoed from every speaker, and the smell of fear seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that nobody knew how to put out, which was probably an accurate description of the current situation. The briefing room looked very different from the last time she had been there, because now it was filled with panicked voices speaking in dozens of languages, while holographic displays showed red indicators spreading across the tactical map like a disease that was consuming. The Allied fleet ship by Ship General Thex 9 stood at the center of the room with his crystal armor showing stress fractures that hadn't been there before, and his voice had lost all its confident thunder as he tried to coordinate a retreat that was becoming more chaotic with every passing minute. Prime strategist Yilandra sat in her chair with her large head held in her hands, while telepathic static leaked from her mind in waves that made everyone in the room feel dizzy and confused. And Lisa could sense that the Volthari's famous mental discipline was cracking under the pressure of watching their fleets being systematically destroyed. The Zellan elders floated near their usual positions, but their starlight robes seemed dimmer than before, and they were frantically consulting holographic archives that contained millions of years of military history, looking for something that might explain how an enemy could learn and adapt so quickly. Admiral Sullivan spotted Lisa as Soon as she entered and gestured for her to join him at the main tactical display, where the scope of the disaster was laid out in brutal detail, with casualty figures that kept climbing and fleet formations that were falling apart under attacks. That seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver. She studied the data for 30 seconds and immediately saw patterns that confirmed everything she had been trying to warn them about, because the swarm wasn't just fighting back anymore, it was actively hunting the most advanced ships with the most sophisticated weapons, as if it wanted to learn from the best examples of galactic military technology. Ryan appeared at her elbow with a data pad full of intercepts from swarm communications. That weren't really communications at all, but some kind of information-sharing process that happened faster than light and allowed the entities to spread their new knowledge instantly across their entire force. The room fell silent when Lisa cleared her throat and began speaking in a voice that carried farther than it should have, because everyone was finally ready to listen to what the human girl had been trying to tell them all along, even though it was probably too late to matter. She explained that the swarm had used their attack to create perfect countermeasures for every type of weapon and defensive system and tactical doctrine in the galactic arsenal, and now they had enough information to defeat any conventional military force. No matter how large or well-equipped General Thex 9 interrupted her with a voice that sounded like breaking stone as he insisted that it was impossible for any enemy to learn that quickly and that there had to be some other explanation for what was happening to their fleets, but his words lacked the conviction they had carried just days before. Lisa continued talking as she pulled up displays showing how the swarm entities were modifying their behavior in real time based on every attack they faced and how they were sharing that information instantly with every other entity in their network, which meant that learning to defeat one of them was the same as learning to defeat all of them. Prime strategist Ylandra looked up from her hands and projected a thought that felt like desperation as she asked if there was any way to counter an enemy that could adapt faster than they could change tactics, and Lisa felt sorry for her because the Volthari had built their entire military philosophy around mental superiority. The answer was that conventional tactics wouldn't work against the swarm because conventional tactics were predictable and based on logical principles that could be analyzed and countered. But there was one type of warfare that might still be effective because it was based on principles that couldn't be analyzed or predicted. She activated a new holographic display that showed her proposed fleet deployment, and the aliens stared at it with expressions of confusion and horror, because it looked like complete chaos with ships positioned in seemingly random formations and attack patterns that violated every principle of military science. Lisa began explaining that human warfare was fundamentally different from alien warfare, because humans didn't follow evolutionary programming or ancient codes of honor, and they didn't optimize their tactics for maximum efficiency, which made them unpredictable in ways that the swarm couldn't analyze. But before she could finish her explanation, the station's threat detection system suddenly activated with alarms that meant immediate danger and red lights that bathed the room in the color of blood, while automated voices announced that unknown contacts were approaching the station at high speed. The sensor displays showed a small group of void swarm entities that had somehow slipped past every defensive perimeter and early warning system without being detected, which should have been impossible but was obviously happening anyway, because the proximity alarms were getting louder and more insistent. Lisa watched in amazement as the greatest military minds in the galaxy reacted to the sudden threat by doing something she would never have expected from beings who had spent their entire lives preparing for war, which was to dive for cover under the conference table like frightened children. General Thex 9 went down first, with his massive crystal armor clanking against the floor as he scrambled for the imagined safety of the table, while Prime Strategist Ylandra followed immediately after, with her telepathic abilities apparently forgotten in the face of immediate physical danger. The Zellan elders dropped out of their floating positions and huddled on the ground with their starlight robes wrapped around them like blankets, while their ancient wisdom proved useless against the basic fear that came from being suddenly confronted by an enemy. They didn't understand. Admiral Sullivan hesitated for just a moment before joining the pile of alien commanders under the table, while Ryan looked around the room with an expression of disbelief, before deciding that if everyone else was hiding, then maybe he should hide too. But Lisa remained standing at the tactical display, studying the sensor readings that showed the swarm entities conducting what appeared to be a scanning operation rather than an attack, because they were using passive sensors instead of weapons, and they seemed more interested in gathering information than causing damage. The station shuddered slightly as the entities performed their scan, but there was no impact, damage, or energy drain, or any of the other effects that usually accompanied swarm attacks, which meant they were probably just taking a closer look at the station's defensive capabilities before moving on. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the proximity alarms stopped, and the red lights faded back to normal as the sensor displays showed the swarm entities moving away from the station at the same high speed they had used to approach it. Lisa looked down at the pile of alien commanders hiding under the table and realized that this moment was going to define everything that happened next, because the symbolism was too obvious for anyone to ignore or explain away. The beings who had dismissed her as too young and too inexperienced and too human to understand real warfare had just demonstrated that when faced with actual danger, they were no braver or calmer or more collected than anyone else, while she had remained standing and focused on understanding what the enemy was doing. General Thex 9 was the first to emerge from under the table, and his attempt to straighten his cracked armor with dignity was undermined by the fact that everyone had just seen him panic like a recruit in his first battle, while the human girl he had been insulting remained calm and professional. Prime Strategist Ylandra crawled out. Next, with her telepathic composure completely shattered, and her mental projections leaking embarrassment and shame in waves that made everyone in the room feel uncomfortable, while Lisa continued studying the sensor logs as if nothing unusual had happened. The Zellan elders floated back to their positions with as much grace as they could manage, but their starlight robes were wrinkled, and their ancient dignity had taken a blow that would probably take centuries to recover from, if it ever recovered at all. Admiral Sullivan and Ryan emerged from their hiding spots looking sheepish, while Lisa finally turned away from the tactical display to face a room full of alien commanders who were struggling to process what had just happened, and what it meant for their assumptions about human inferiority. The morning of Operation Starbreak arrived with all the ceremony and confidence that 10,000 warships could provide, and Lisa watched from the bridge of the Defiance as the massive alien armada moved into attack formation with precision that would have been beautiful if she wasn't so sure it was about to become a massacre. General Thex 9 broadcast his final tactical briefing to the entire fleet, with his voice booming across every communication channel as he reminded everyone that they were fighting for the future of civilized space, and that their overwhelming superiority would crush the Void Swarm threat once and for all, which sounded inspiring until you remembered that he had refused to listen to any alternative strategies. The Crithian heavy assault ships took the lead with their crystal armor gleaming under the light of nearby stars, while their massive weapons charged up with energy that could crack planets, and behind them came wave after wave of ships from every corner of the galaxy, all following battle plans that had been used successfully for thousands of years. Prime strategist Yelandra coordinated the Volthari squadrons through telepathic links that allowed them to move like a single organism, while the Zellan elders directed their ancient warships with technology that was older than human civilization and more powerful than anything Earth had ever dreamed of building. Lisa stood at her observation post and watched the tactical displays show. Friendly contacts moving toward the red blips that represented void swarm entities, and she felt sick to her stomach because she could already see that something was wrong with the whole situation, even though the initial reports sounded positive. The first wave of Crithian ships engaged the swarm at maximum range with devastating volleys of plasma fire that lit up space like artificial suns. And the immediate damage assessments showed that dozens of entities were being destroyed or severely damaged, which should have been good news, except that Lisa noticed the swarm wasn't responding the way it should. Ryan stood beside her monitoring the communication channels, and he pointed out that the enemy formations were shifting in ways that didn't make tactical sense because they weren't trying to minimize casualties or protect their strongest units, and they weren't attempting to disengage even though they were clearly outgunned. Instead, the void swarm entities seemed to be moving deliberately into positions where they would take more damage, while simultaneously exposing the attacking fleet to counterattacks that they could have avoided if they were trying to win the battle, which meant they had different priorities then. Anyone expected Lisa tried to contact the fleet commanders to warn them that the swarm was behaving like it wanted to be attacked rather than trying to defend itself, but her messages were automatically routed to Admiral Sullivan, who was too busy monitoring his own tactical situation to pay attention to her theories about enemy behavior patterns. The second wave attack began with Volthari ships using their advanced targeting systems to pick off individual entities with surgical precision, while maintaining perfect formation discipline, but Lisa could see that each successful hit was being analyzed by the surviving swarm units, which were adapting their defensive measures in real time. She watched in growing horror as the swarm entities began moving in ways that made the Volthari targeting computers less effective, and their energy absorption capabilities seemed to be improving with every weapon that hit them, which meant they were learning to counter every attack even as it was happening. The Zellan ancient ships joined the battle with weapons that manipulated space-time itself, and for a few minutes it looked like their reality-bending technology might be too exotic for the swarm to analyze. But then Lisa saw the entities beginning to move in patterns that suggested they were figuring out how to predict and avoid the temporal distortions. Ryan's voice was tight with concern as he reported that swarm entities were starting to reproduce faster than they were being destroyed, and some of the new entities were showing resistance to weapon types that had been effective just minutes earlier, which confirmed Lisa's worst fears about what was really happening. She grabbed the communication console and tried to reach every fleet commander simultaneously with an emergency override, but her transmission was blocked by automated systems that classified her warnings as unauthorized tactical interference, and she realized that she was trapped watching a disaster unfold with no way to stop it. The battle reports coming in over the next hour told a story that should have been impossible but was happening anyway, as the most advanced military technology in the galaxy proved less and less effective against an enemy that was learning and adapting faster than anyone thought possible. Crithian crystal armor that had never failed in 1,000 years of warfare was being penetrated by swarm energy drains that seemed specifically designed to exploit microscopic flaws that the entities shouldn't have been able to detect and analyze so quickly. Voltheri telepathic coordination was being disrupted by some kind of psychic interference that felt familiar to Lisa because it reminded her of the mental probes. She had deflected during the briefing but amplified beyond anything she had experienced before. The Zellan temporal weapons were becoming less effective as the swarm entities learned to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously, which was supposed to be impossible according to every physics textbook ever written. But the Void Swarm apparently hadn't read those books. Lisa realized that the aliens had provided the swarm with the most comprehensive military education in galactic history by attacking with every type of weapon and defensive system and tactical doctrine that existed, and now the entities were using that knowledge to turn the galaxy's own strengths against itself. She tried one more time to reach General Thex 9 directly. By using emergency command codes that Admiral Sullivan had given her, but his communications officer curtly informed her that the general was engaged in combat operations and could not be disturbed by support personnel with non-critical concerns. The irony was devastating because her concerns were the most critical thing anyone should have been thinking about. But she had been classified as irrelevant, and her warnings were being treated as background noise while the greatest military disaster in galactic history unfolded exactly the way she had predicted it would. Ryan was monitoring casualty reports that were starting to come in as the first Krithian heavy cruisers began taking significant damage from weapons that seemed to know exactly where their weak points were, and he looked at Lisa with an expression that said he finally understood what she had been trying to warn everyone about. But understanding wasn't enough because they were trapped on the sidelines watching the alien. Fleets learned the hard way that their enemy was smarter and more adaptable than they had ever imagined, and every minute of combat was making the swarm stronger while making the galaxy's defenders weaker. The tactical displays showed friendly contacts beginning to disappear as ships that had been built to last for centuries were being destroyed or disabled by an enemy that was rewriting the rules of warfare in real time. And Lisa knew that this was just the beginning of something much worse. She stood at her observation post, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life, while 10,000 of the most advanced warships ever built discovered that all their technology and experience and ancient wisdom meant nothing against an enemy that could learn faster than they could adapt. The Void Swarm had just been given the greatest gift any military force could receive, which was complete intelligence about their opponent's capabilities and limitations. And now they were using that gift to turn the galaxy's own weapons into instruments of its destruction. Lisa watched the battle continue to deteriorate and realized that everything she had tried to prevent was happening exactly as she had predicted. But knowing she was right didn't make her feel any better about watching so many people die because nobody would listen to the girl who was supposedly too young to understand real warfare. Lisa spent the next 2 days in her small quarters aboard the human vessel Defiance, staring at data streams that painted pictures of destruction across the galaxy, while the alien fleet commanders ignored every message she sent them and continued planning their massive assault as if she didn't exist at all, which was becoming a familiar feeling. The Void Swarm attacks followed patterns that made perfect sense once you stopped thinking like a traditional military strategist and started thinking like something that was hunting for very specific things. But every time Lisa tried to explain this to the alien commanders, they acted like she was speaking a completely different language, which maybe she was. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Carter knocked on her door with coffee and the kind of worried expression that meant he had more bad news to share. And when she let him in, he sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk and said the alien fleets were already moving into position for Operation Starbreak, despite all her warnings about what would happen. She pulled up the tactical display that showed over 10,000 ships from 17 different worlds gathering near the Centauri Nebula, where the largest concentration of void swarm entities had been detected, and it was an impressive sight that would have made her feel proud and hopeful if she didn't know it was probably going to be a disaster. The problem was that everyone else saw the swarm as just another enemy, to be defeated with superior firepower and better tactics. But Lisa had been studying the attack patterns for months, and she could see that the entities weren't behaving like any military force in recorded history, which should have been a warning sign. But apparently she was the only one who thought so. Ryan pulled up his own datapad and showed her the latest intelligence reports that described void swarm entities as roughly spherical objects about the size of a small ship with the ability to drain energy from anything they touched and reproduce by splitting into multiple copies of themselves. But Lisa knew there was more to it than that, because she had seen them in action. The entities moved in ways that defied physics and seemed to communicate without any detectable signals, and most importantly, they learned from every encounter, which meant that every battle the galaxy fought against them just made them stronger and smarter. But when she tried to explain this to the alien commanders, they dismissed her concerns as human paranoia. General Thex 9 had actually laughed when she suggested that the swarm might be using their attacks as learning experiences, and he told her that real warriors understood that victory came from strength and courage, not from overthinking every little detail, which was exactly the kind of attitude that was going to get everyone killed. Lisa had tried going over his head to the Crithian High Command, but they responded with a formal letter that politely suggested she focus on support operations and leave the real military planning to those with proper experience and training, which was diplomatic language for telling her to shut up and stay out of the way. The Volthari were even worse, because they used their telepathic abilities to project feelings of condescension and dismissal whenever she tried to communicate with them, and Prime Strategist Yilandra had actually sent her a mental image of a human child playing with toy soldiers, which was insulting enough to make Lisa consider filing a formal complaint. The Zelon elders were impossible to reach because they only communicated through intermediaries who seemed to think that human military theories were amusing curiosities rather than serious tactical considerations. And when she finally got a message through to them, they responded with what appeared to be a very polite way of saying that species with such short lifespans couldn't possibly understand long-term strategic thinking. But Lisa kept working on her analysis because she knew she was right, even if nobody wanted to listen to her. And the more she studied the swarm attack patterns, the more convinced she became that they were dealing with something that operated on completely different principles from anything the galaxy had seen before. The entities didn't conquer territory or capture resources or eliminate threats the way normal military forces did, and they didn't seem interested in controlling space lanes or establishing strategic positions, which meant they had goals that nobody had figured out yet, and that made them incredibly dangerous. Ryan helped her map out every known swarm attack over the past year, and when they laid all the data out on the big display in her quarters, the pattern became clear enough that even someone who wasn't a military analyst could see it. But when she tried to show the same information to the alien commanders, they refused to look at it seriously. The swarm was harvesting something, but it wasn't resources or technology or even living beings, and Lisa thought it might be information or energy patterns or maybe something that current science couldn't even measure yet. But whatever. It was the entities were very selective about their targets. They hit colonies that had certain types of power systems and ignored others that were more heavily defended, and they attacked research stations that were working on specific kinds of projects while leaving military installations alone until those installations tried to interfere with their operations. Most telling of all was the fact that they always withdrew before completely destroying their targets, which suggested that total destruction wasn't their goal, and they seemed to be more interested in studying their opponents than in defeating them, which should have been terrifying to anyone who understood what that implied. Lisa realized that every time the galaxy sent fleets to fight the swarm, the entities were learning about military tactics and weapon systems and defensive strategies, and they were getting better at countering all of them, which meant that Operation Starbreak was going to provide them with the largest and most comprehensive military education in galactic history. She tried one more time to reach General Thex 9 directly, but his communications officer informed her that the general was too busy with real military matters to entertain human concerns. And when she asked to speak with Prime Strategist Ylandra, she received a telepathic message that felt like being dismissed by a parent who was tired of dealing with a persistent child. The Zelon elders didn't even respond to her messages anymore, which Lisa took as a sign that they had written her off completely and decided that human input wasn't worth their time or attention, which was frustrating but not really surprising, given how they had treated her during the briefing. Admiral Sullivan tried to be supportive, but even he seemed uncertain when faced with the unanimous skepticism of the alien military leadership, and Lisa could tell that he was starting to wonder if maybe she really was too young and inexperienced for this kind of responsibility, which hurt more than all the alien insults combined. She spent her nights staring out the viewport at the stars and wondering if she was crazy to think that she could see patterns that beings with thousands of years of military experience had missed. But every time she looked at the data, the same conclusions stared back at her, and she knew that Operation Starbreak was going to be a trap. The worst part was that she was going to have to watch it happen from the sidelines, because her role had been officially downgraded to tactical observation and support operations, which meant she would get to see everything go wrong without being able to do anything about it. Ryan found her in the observation lounge at 0300 hours, staring at the fleet formations that were moving into their final positions, and he sat down beside her without saying anything, because they both knew that in less than 6 hours, the largest military operation in galactic history was going to begin. And nobody was listening to the one person who understood what they were really up against. Lisa Brooks walked through the metal corridors of New Geneva Station with her boots making soft sounds on the floor, but nobody seemed to notice her at all, which was nothing new really, because most people looked right past her like she was invisible. Or maybe they just saw what they expected to see, which was a young woman who looked too small and too quiet to be important. The station was huge and busy with aliens from all over the galaxy rushing around doing important things, and Lisa felt even smaller next to them because some of them were 8 feet tall with crystal skin that sparkled under the lights, while others moved like liquid shadows with eyes that glowed in the dark. And then there were the ancient ones who floated instead of walking and seemed to know secrets that were older than Earth itself. She checked her watch and realized she was going to be late for the most important meeting of her life, which was funny because 6 months ago she had been just another officer on a small patrol ship near Jupiter, and now she was supposed to be in charge of the biggest fleet operation in galactic history, but nobody had bothered to tell the aliens that part yet. The briefing room doors were massive and decorated with symbols from every world in the Alliance, but when Lisa pressed her hand to the scanner, the doors opened with a whisper, and she stepped inside to find herself facing the most powerful military minds in known space, who all turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely hidden amusement Admiral Jake Sullivan stood up from his chair and gestured for her to come forward, but Lisa could already hear the whispers starting in languages she didn't recognize, though she was pretty. Sure, they weren't saying nice things about her, because the tone was all wrong and some of the aliens were actually pointing at her like she was some kind of strange animal they had never seen before. General Thex 9 was the biggest alien in the room, with crystal armor that looked like it could stop a missile. And when he spoke, his voice sounded like rocks grinding together as he said something in his own language that made the other Crithians laugh in a way that sounded like breaking glass, which probably wasn't a good sign. The Volthari delegation sat in a perfect circle, with their large heads tilted at exactly the same angle as they shared thoughts without speaking, and Lisa could feel something like cold fingers touching the edges of her mind, but she had been trained to resist telepathic probes, so she pushed back gently and felt them withdraw with what might have been surprise. Admiral Sullivan cleared his throat and announced that Commander Lisa Brooks would be leading the joint fleet operation against the Void Swarm threat, but his words seemed to hang in the air like a bad joke that nobody found funny, and Lisa watched as the aliens exchanged looks that clearly said they thought someone had made a terrible mistake. She walked to the empty chair that had been left for her at the strategy table and noticed how the aliens seemed to lean away from her section like she might be contagious or dangerous, which was ironic because she was probably the least dangerous person in the room, unless you counted her habit of asking uncomfortable questions. The Zellan elders floated at the far end of the table, wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of starlight, and they spoke in voices that sounded like whispers from across the galaxy. But Lisa caught enough words to know they were discussing whether humans had enough brain development to understand complex military strategy, which was insulting but not really surprising. Prime Strategist Yil Andra finally spoke out loud in perfect English with an accent that sounded like music, but her words were sharp as she asked if Earth was really serious about putting someone so young and inexperienced in charge of such an important mission. And Admiral Sullivan started to answer, but Lisa held up her hand and said she could speak for herself. The room got very quiet when she stood up and walked to the holographic display that showed the current situation with red dots marking where the Void Swarm had attacked, and yellow dots showing where they might strike next. And Lisa studied the pattern while everyone watched her like they were waiting for her to say something stupid. She had spent weeks analyzing this data, and she could see things that the aliens seemed to be missing. But when she started to explain her theories about how the swarm was selecting targets, the whispers started again, and this time she could understand some of them because several species were using translation devices that leaked audio. One Crithian officer muttered that humans were too primitive to understand real warfare, while a Volthari strategist projected the thought that Lisa was probably just guessing and hoping to get lucky, and the Zellan elders made sounds. That might have been laughter if elders who were thousands of years old were capable of finding anything funny anymore. General Thex 9 stood up to his full height, which was impressive and terrifying at the same time, and announced that while he respected Admiral Sullivan and the human contribution to the Alliance, he had serious doubts about putting someone with no real combat experience in charge of fleets that represented the combined military might of 17 different worlds. Lisa felt her face getting hot, but she kept her voice calm as she pointed out that she had more experience fighting the Void Swarm than anyone else in the room, because she had been there when they destroyed the colony on Kepler 442b, and she had seen things that the after-action reports didn't mention, but her words were interrupted by more whispers and what sounded like alien laughter. The meeting went on for 3 more hours, with the aliens presenting their traditional battle plans that involved massive formations and overwhelming firepower and ancient tactics that had worked for them for centuries, while Lisa sat quietly and took notes and tried not to let her frustration show because she could see the flaws in every single strategy. They proposed. When Admiral Sullivan finally asked if she had any input, Lisa stood up again and began explaining her analysis of the Void Swarm behavior patterns. But she was only halfway through her first sentence when General Thex 9 interrupted her with a gesture that was probably rude in any language, and said that primitive human intuition was not what they needed in this situation. Prime strategist Yelandra agreed with a telepathic pulse that felt like ice water and added that humans lacked the evolutionary development necessary to comprehend threats on this scale, while the Zellan elders simply turned away from Lisa entirely, as if she had stopped existing, which hurt more than the insults somehow. The meeting ended with the aliens agreeing to proceed with Operation Starbreak, which was everything Lisa had tried to warn them against, but nobody wanted to listen to the small human girl who looked like she should be in school instead of commanding star fleets. And she watched them file out of the room, still whispering about her in languages she was starting to understand better than she wanted. To Admiral Sullivan put his hand on her shoulder and told her not to take it personally, because the aliens would come. Around once they saw what humans could do, but Lisa wasn't so sure because she had seen the look in their eyes, and she knew that some kinds of prejudice ran deeper than oceans and older than stars.